Hila needs no introduction to many of us, but nevertheless, we're very formal here. So she's an associate professor at Aviv University, Faculty of Law, and she teaches and researches in the field of employment, labor, immigration, and welfare law, with focus on issues of labor trafficking and gender equality. And in 2018, Hila received the ERC grant to pursue research on a labor approach to human trafficking and established the Travel Research Group. Please.
So thank you very much to all of you and to our fabulous speakers. So we started with this panel to talk about solidarity, and there's the kind of the banalist understanding here is that to the question, can solidarity assist workers in resisting exploitation? The obvious answer is yes, right? We know it's banal to say. We know that unionized workplaces have less exploitation in them usually, of course, less trafficking in them. But of course, unionization is at the extreme side of solidarity, but we can see the different forms of solidarity can assist. We heard from Russell yesterday, from her ethnographic study, that workers who have a community will make more moral claims in relation to their employers because they have a community that will validate their stance. And we heard it from Yuval in his opening remarks about the Julani case, and from each one of our speakers today, that solidarity really helps workers resist exploitative working conditions. But solidarity, of course, like resistance, comes in many stripes and forms. And the key question for many of us in the field of workers' rights is, especially for workers in the most precarious labor sectors, that face different degrees of unfreedom, is what structures can enable or sustain or strengthen effective acts of solidarity and resistance. And in the panel today, our speakers pointed to various such elements, and one key is the role of law. So legal categories, legal structures, and as Manoj beautifully explained, legal categories don't stand alone. They're intriguing elements because they have social effects. So the social effects of law is key here. And the question is how these legal categories take part in subject formation, in identity formation, and in solidarity formation. So we heard from our three speakers about groups that are traditionally seen, both in law and in sociology as well, as perhaps impossible legal subjects, right? If I use May Nagai's terminology, they're impossible here because they appear to be extremely non-standard workers. They're migrants, often undocumented migrants. They work in occupations that are legally and socially not seen as labor or are formally not perceived as workers, as the Deliveroo workers. And sex workers as well. And therefore, they don't even have in their toolkit the legal tools available for workers to make rights claims. So traditionally, this is the case of domestic workers that are excluded from most labor and employment regulation in many countries. Of course, sex workers that, as Inga started her talk, usually just not perceived as workers at all. And of course, independent contractors, and to some extent even farm workers, the example of the Coalition of Immokalee workers that in the US have a long tradition of organizing, but in many places around the world have a very difficult time organizing. Yet these workers in the three talks we heard today find ways to work in solidarity to resist exploitation and improve their conditions. So this is a surprisingly optimistic panel, I must say, uncharacteristic of anything that's happening in TrafLab. But but I also, it's optimistic, but let's not celebrate too much. God forbid, this agency should be cautiously celebrated because in many such struggles, there is still much to desire in terms of victories, and victories are often temporary and partial. And perhaps the Coalition of Immokalee workers is somewhat different because they created a new structure, and some of the domestic workers struggles as well. But often there's something very fluid and not structural about some of these changes, and an attempt to create a structural change. But the law, in any case, is crucial, even if not a determining aspect here. but it's crucial in different ways, because in Manoj's paper, he introduces to the different ways that law sustains and supports solidarity, and mostly the ways in which it challenges it. So challenges that result from different categories that split interest groups and create different identity groups, such as documented versus undocumented, and that we all know that there are very different interests often to these groups. Worker versus independent contractor, again, very different elements. So he documented the way that the fragmentation of identity through law makes it difficult for workers to come together, overcome differences, and present a united front against an employer. But perhaps the surprising side effect is that sometimes the same legal categories that are supposed to split or generally split workers apart enable just as much as they disable, or first disable and then enable solidaristic action, especially when we understand the legal categories operate in tandem with these social differences. And these 2 points are clearly evident in Inga's and Helen's paper. So in the case of sex workers, the legal category of trafficking has been extremely polarizing. It made local and migrant sex workers seek very different paths, at least originally. Local workers wanted to distance themselves from, and maybe we'll hear more about it from Naomi later, I don't know, distance themselves from the legal category of trafficking that brought with it not only the stigmatization of victimhood, but also the paternalistic desire to save victims, backed by a very coercive power of border control and of police. So local sex workers wanted to distance themselves from that. Migrant sex workers, some of them found some assistance in it. Eventually, they found a way to get a visa, sometimes even temporary, or to get some shelter and some assistance in difficult cases. So this created a split. But what we see in Inga's research, that the same legal order that eventually slowly sees all sex workers as potential victims of trafficking ended up bringing the groups together, because in a slow and gradual process that is still very much underway, the negative effects of the very repressive and restrictive policies ended up negatively affecting all sex workers, leading to a united cause to fight against it. And this is what we saw in Juno Mack's quote, right? She says, migrants' struggle is sex workers' struggle, and it's one and the same. This is not a position that was common in this field until recently, but it's the restrictive policies that brought this about. In Helen's paper about domestic workers, there is a story that she did also in her previous research about the legal category of domestic worker as a new form of identity that these workers are taking on. And this identity comes about for one reason, because their workers are excluded from so many laws. Because their exclusion leads them to make some new claims to the legal order and fight in the international level for the Convention for Decent Work for domestic workers. So Helen shows us in her work the galvanizing power of an international convention. That I must say that when it passed, I was extremely suspect of it, of what it will do. But we see on the ground that it really brought about new energy to domestic work organizing, as Helen showed us. The convention brought workers together at the international level and then sent them retooled and with new partners to their different contexts to fight for change. And since the convention passed, there's really a proliferation of workers' organizations. And as we saw, unions are coming in as well for the first time usually not seeing domestic workers as workers, and are coming in new ways, either as a trade union that represents workers, or as a hybrid. But I want to end with a couple of questions to all of you. So in his classic study of resistance, beautiful book, Weapons of the Weak, James Scott suggests that when the severely oppressed resist subordination, the resistance can be traced through everyday forms of resistance and are actually usually not politically oriented. Though perhaps their aggregate effect may end up being extremely significant and have political impact. Here today, we didn't hear so much about that everyday struggle, right? We heard about the very kind of the extreme of the spectrum of solidarity, which is the union or the coming together form. I believe that these moments came from a lot of everyday resistance and still are practiced in a way in many forms of everyday resistance. I would like to hear more from all of you, from your research, about the interrelation between everyday resistance and that aggregate adding up to political action, which is really quite unique in this field. And I also want to ask you what can explain this. What made these three cases of extremely oppressed groups and extremely exploited groups be able to overcome it and come together in this way? And I think one element can be, to go back to Russell's talk yesterday, the expanded moral and also legal toolkit provided by specific workers' campaigns around sex work, domestic work, farm work, the gig economy. And at least in some of these cases, I think trafficking is extremely related, both in farm work, and in the case of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, definitely in domestic work and in sex work. The category of trafficking was, in a sense, had such a big footprint in the field that it led to counteraction. So it brought with it police, it brought with it borders, and then workers started responding to what they see as further repression by a regime that attempts to assist them. So I think there is a really interesting dynamic here that I would love to hear more about from all of you. And I just want to put another element there that I didn't hear much from in your talks, and that's civil society, right? So we talked a lot, and many of us are big believers in the power of the workers themselves to make the difference. But in many cases, unfortunately, and as we heard yesterday from United Children Israel, the workers themselves, especially from very marginalized groups, cannot do it without support from some form of civil society that has more social capital than them in the country where they operate. And it's a big question. I mean, whether that is needed, whether that actually hampers it, So I would love to hear more from you guys. And I think it's in the context of sex work, it's particularly interesting because the feminism has been a huge player in the world of anti-trafficking, but in a way that was, at least from my standpoint, and I think I share it with Inga, but it's controversial within the feminist world, extremely unsolidaristic, right? It's been in a way that comes from the top, does not come from the workers themselves, have no interest in what the workers are doing. And in fact, some of sex workers' organizing comes as a response to this specific form of feminism and brings with it a different one. So we have social movements in all places, right? Social movements don't necessarily always support the workers, right? Social movements can hamper this, can try to overtake the voice of the workers, and so forth. So for example, end demand legislation in relation to the sex industry has been, in a sense, its own galvanizing force. We see in many countries the sex workers are coming together after end demand legislation. This happened in Israel, it happens in Sweden, it happened in other countries as well. How much time do I have left?
Daphne claims none.
Daphne claims none. So I will just not say the last thing I wanted to say, though I'm very tempted. I will tell it to everybody later. Thank you very much.